Turi is a small city in Georgia, not the US state, but a country in the Caucasus. It has fewer than 50,000 people. You might have a hard time finding it on a map, but its flavors would later make their way into the Kremlin and change what a Soviet feast could look like. This was the birthplace of a man who would later give himself a name that meant steel: Stalin. Some rulers are remembered through cigars and whiskey, others through vegetarianism and self-denial. But Stalin, true to the name he chose, seemed to have a stomach of steel. In Stalin's time, his dinner table may have been one of the most secretive places in the Soviet Union. It was surrounded by secrecy, surveillance, and fear. Just picture it. While Americans were eating burgers, Soviet tables already had caviar and champagne. Or at least, that was what the propaganda said. How could luxuries like these belong to ordinary people? Welcome to Relish History. Today, we're looking at Stalin's table, and the table of the Soviet people. Russian power was centered in Moscow, but the soul of Stalin's dinner table came from Georgia. If the Russian table was black bread and a glass of vodka, the Georgian table was something else entirely. A feast built around wine, walnuts, and meat roasted over charcoal. Georgia sits just south of the Caucasus Mountains, near the Black Sea, with old trade routes linking it to West Asia and the surrounding region. That geography shaped the way Georgian food tastes: brighter, sharper, and more aromatic. Wine, walnuts, herbs, cheese, sour plum sauce, and charcoal grilled meat all became part of a food culture completely different from the Russian table. There's even a local creation myth that says it best. God was so absorbed in his meal that food spilled from his plate onto the earth, and that spilled food became Georgia. In Georgia, food was never just about filling your stomach. It was about the land, good fortune, and the way you treated the guest. You can see that most clearly in the supra, Georgia's traditional feast around a long table. This was not the kind of dinner where one main dish sits in the center with a few sides around it. The table kept filling up. Wine kept coming, glass after glass. The toastmaster guided the rhythm of the meal, and guests had a hard time refusing the host's food or wine. A meal could last for hours. Sometimes it could last all night. For many years, Stalin's diet, like Lenin's, was hardly refined. Simple soups, buckwheat, and beef. He and his wife ate in a Kremlin dining hall. Vyacheslav Molotov, one of Stalin's closest officials, later recalled that the only thing that even counted as a full luxury was a bathtub full of pickled cucumbers. After his wife's suicide in 1932, Stalin became even more closed off, more grim, and more suspicious of the people around him. Compared with unfamiliar cooks, he was more willing to trust fellow Georgians. And when Sasha Ignatashvili entered the Kremlin, Stalin's menu gradually began to return to the flavors of his childhood. Sasha had once run restaurants and a wholesale wine business in Georgia. He brought in sheep, turkeys, wine, bread ovens, and cooks from the Racha region, all to keep Stalin's food supply safe, healthy, and under control. Soon, Georgian abundance, drinking rituals, and the toastmaster himself all became part of Kremlin dinners. Unlike the vodka poured at late-night dinners to get other men drunk, Georgian wine was much closer to Stalin's own taste. When it came to wine, Georgian wine was the only kind he would drink. Georgia's wine history can be traced back to around 6000 to 5800 BC, making it one of the earliest wine-producing regions in the world. In Georgia, people have long told the story that special planes were sent from Moscow to pick up authentic Georgian wine for Stalin. Stalin loved classic Georgian wines like Kvanchkara and Kinsmarauli. In his later years, he also liked a yon, slightly sparkling homemade wine called Majari, which he called juice for children. Meat, of course, was central to Stalin's meals. Shashlik, a kind of charcoal grilled meat skewer, carried one of the most direct tastes of Stalin's homeland. Because his mother had once worked as a cook, Stalin hated the smell of cooking for the rest of his life. But he still knew how proper shashlik should be made. Shashlik is common across the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Russia. The Georgian version is usually called mutsvadi. Shashlik is not about heavy sauce. It is about meat, salt, and charcoal smoke. The meat is cut into large pieces, salted, skewered, and slowly roasted over the coals. But once this food reached the Kremlin, it was no longer just a simple dish from home. Stalin's food sources had to be reliable. By then, Sasha was far more than a cook. He had to make sure everything placed in front of Stalin was safe, and he had to taste it himself to ease Stalin's fear of being poisoned. Nothing could reach Stalin unless it had first passed through Sasha's hands and throat. Fish was also one of the foods Stalin ate most often, but that taste did not come from Georgia. Back in the Tsarist era, when Stalin and his comrades were exiled in Siberia, they had agreed to split up the chores: cooking, cleaning, and shopping. But Stalin quickly avoided the kitchen and the dishwashing and left himself with hunting and fishing. Later, fish took on a completely different meaning at Stalin's table. At the Yalta Conference, fish was no longer just something to eat. It became part of the Soviet Union's display of power to the world. The menu included pickled herring, smoked sturgeon, sturgeon in aspic, red and black caviar, and whitefish with champagne sauce. After the Tehran Conference, Stalin even sent Roosevelt a 3-foot-long sturgeon, and Roosevelt reportedly had no idea what to do with it. But Stalin's favorite fish was not the sturgeon or caviar that made a banquet look rich, powerful, and important. It was herring. Herring was cheap, easy to store, easy to pickle, and extremely common on Russian and Eastern European tables. Later, the Soviet New Year dish, herring under a fur coat, a layered herring salad, became a holiday dish ordinary families could actually put on a table for the same reason. It was simple, inexpensive, and easy to keep. For Stalin, the closest thing to a taste of home may have been traditional Georgian walnut jam. Walnuts are central to Georgian cooking. They are often ground and used in soups and sauces, adding thickness and flavor much the way butter does in French cooking. To make good walnut jam, you need young walnuts picked before the shell has formed. They are soaked for days, boiled for 10 minutes, then added to a pot with sugar, lemon juice, and vanilla powder. Once the jam cools, it is ready to eat. Even after Stalin became the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, his mother, Keke, reportedly sent homemade walnut jam directly to the Kremlin several times, so her son could still taste a piece of home. These foods shaped Stalin's private tastes, but at his late-night dinners, food became a way to test obedience. Stalin's nights began at the movies. Before he arrived, wine, chocolate, cigarettes, and mineral water would already be waiting at his seat. Stalin loved old films from the 1930s, including Volga Volga, In Old Chicago, and anything by Chaplin. He often watched 2 films in a row. Then, around 2 in the morning, Stalin would say, "Let's go and get something to eat." Of course, this was not an invitation anyone could refuse. The meal could last 6 hours, all the way until dawn. Dinner began with drinking, usually wine and champagne. From that point on, it was everyone else's turn to perform. At these dinners, the guests were pushed to drink again and again until they were completely drunk. This was one of the places where Stalin showed everyone who was in charge. Mikoyan later recalled that Stalin forced them to drink to loosen our tongues. The more they drank, the more chaotic the dinners became. The pranks looked childish, but they were part of the way power worked at Stalin's table. Mikoyan's pants were stuffed with tomatoes until they burst, so later he had to bring 2 pairs of pants to dinner. And when Stalin saw men like Beria and Khrushchev drinking until they vomited, he was ready to burst out laughing. Stalin's dinners were clearly a test of power over the men around him, and a significant part of Soviet policy was shaped at these dinners. The table was loaded with Georgian dishes Stalin loved. This was not a delicate French-style feast. It was simple, heavy, and overflowing with food. So when Mikoyan reported a problem with food shortages, Stalin seemed unable to accept anything that spoiled the mood. Facing a table full of food, he kept asking, "Why is there no food?" Beria and Melenkov had to step hard on Mikoyan's foot to warn him. "It just irritates Stalin. He begins to attack one or other of us. He should be told only what he likes to hear to create a nice atmosphere, not to spoil the dinner." After the meal, Stalin would start dancing Georgian folk dances. Sometimes he would sing Georgian folk songs. Only in the early morning would the dinner finally end. At these late-night feasts, Stalin was clearly the only one who did not seem exhausted. In the end, he was also the only one who could stay fully awake. And yet, for all his power to force other men to open their mouths, he could never fully trust food on his own plate. He would make Khrushchev taste the lamb and herring first. He also suspected food that other people sent to him. These men were forced to drink, forced to endure humiliation, and in the end, they all put up with it. But at the Revolution anniversary dinner in 1932, there was one exception. When Stalin rudely ordered his wife, Nadezhda, to drink in front of everyone, she answered back, "My name is not Hay." Then she left the table. The next morning, she was found dead. She had taken her own life. Next to Stalin's overflowing dinner table, ordinary Soviet meals were much simpler. But even there, certain luxuries began to appear in ways Americans might not have expected. For a century that had just lived through a famine that killed millions of people, something strange happened. All at once, champagne, caviar, and ice cream were being presented as things regular people were supposed to enjoy too. Soviet champagne probably did not taste like French champagne, dry, crisp, and complex. It was sweeter, bubblier, and felt more like something you drank at a celebration. Russians had long been more open to sweet and semi-sweet sparkling wines. More importantly, Soviet champagne did not rely on long aging in the bottle to develop its flavor. Instead, it used a pressurized tank method that shortened the maturation process to about a month and allowed producers to make 5,000 to 10,000 liters at a time. That speed brought volume, but it also sacrificed complexity. So, sweetness was often used to cover up flaws in the wine itself. And that was exactly why champagne could be turned into a mass-market luxury. It was sweet. It was fast. It could be produced in large quantities. Soviet champagne only took off because Stalin helped push it forward. Champagne had once been seen as a symbol of decadent luxury in the capitalist world. But in 1936, Stalin suddenly declared it was an important sign of material well-being, of the good life. By the mid-1930s, Soviet propaganda was placing more and more emphasis on better living and more things to buy. That was the mood behind Stalin's famous line, "Life has become better, comrades. Life has become more cheerful." If luxuries like these could be seen across the Soviet Union, or at least in stores, on holidays, and in propaganda posters, then they could serve as proof that Soviet life was starting to look like the kind of life once reserved for elites. Maybe even better than life in the capitalist world. By the end of the 1930s, Soviet champagne had become a very popular consumer product. In major cities, it could be bought before public holidays. Even during the food shortages and economic crisis of 1936 and 1937, Soviet mass production of champagne was still moving ahead. And even in the difficult years of World War II, the plan for large-scale champagne production was not forgotten. The target itself was staggering. In 1937, Mikoyan ordered the Soviet Union to produce 12 million bottles of champagne over the next 5 years, at a time when the country's annual champagne production was only in the hundreds of thousands. The champagne project outlived the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet Union is gone, but the name Soviet champagne has not completely disappeared. Today, in Russian supermarkets and on retail platforms, you can still find sparkling wine labeled Sovetskoy. Caviar was another strange Soviet necessity. This was not a luxury the Soviet Union had to make up from scratch. The Soviet Union inherited the Russian Empire's most important regions for caviar production. It had the Caspian Sea, the Volga Delta, and the sturgeon fisheries around Astrakhan. In other words, it had world-class caviar. In the Soviet Union, caviar was not supposed to belong only to silver spoons and fancy restaurants. More commonly, it was served with drinks, put on holiday cold platters, or spread on buttered bread. Caviar production was limited, but the state still wanted it distributed widely, at a price that could still be called affordable. In 1934, the most expensive caviar in Leningrad cost 60 rubles per kilogram, about one-third of a young industrial worker's monthly wage. A nurse could finish work, walk into the Solovyov food store with her colleagues, and buy a black caviar sandwich. Champagne could be scaled up with the tank method. Caviar could not. Caviar depended on sturgeon, river deltas, and fishing seasons. It was not something that could be expanded endlessly like an industrial product. And because it was limited, the state had even more reason to control how it was distributed, who could buy it, and what sizes it came in. As a result, 90% of Soviet-produced caviar was kept for the domestic market. To make it easier to sell at retail, high-end food stores sold caviar in small 100, 250, and 500-gram tins. The packaging itself became part of a display of Soviet abundance. And this is where caviar becomes especially Soviet. It was described as a food ordinary people could enjoy, but the price was never really ordinary, and neither was access. At elite distribution centers, 1 kilogram of caviar cost only 9 rubles. In state commercial stores, the same thing cost 35 rubles. So for the elite, caviar really was much closer to a cheap necessity. While propaganda posters showed tables piled high with food and glasses of champagne, real people were standing in the cold at 3 in the morning, waiting in line for bread. Just a few years before champagne and caviar were pushed onto the table of the new life, famine had killed at least 3 million people. Look at a real menu of one working-class family in the 1930s. In one day, they ate only a third of a loaf of black bread, 2 or 3 slices of white bread, 1 plate of porridge, little vegetable oil, a few potatoes, and a bowl of thin soup with small pieces of fish in it. They got only 40 to 70 grams of meat, probably less than the meat in an American hamburger patty. The children could get a little cheap candy, but milk came only once every 4 or 5 days. This was the age when life had become better. In 1926, a worker could still eat about 150 grams of meat a day. By 1933, that number had fallen to around 40 grams. Diets had become that poor, and workers were still spending 60% of their income on food. By 1940, workers in Sverdlovsk province were saying, "We often cannot buy bread for 2 or 3 days." That same year, right before the anniversary of the October Revolution, Leningrad still planned to put out 25,000 bottles of champagne for the celebration. Meanwhile, in Stalingrad, people were lining up for bread at 2 or 3 in the morning. People complained that there was no meat in the stores, no cabbage, no potatoes or other vegetables, and no milk or butter. Local famines appeared again. Some people even hoped rationing would come back, because at least rationing could guarantee a basic share. Standing in line became one of the basic routines of Soviet daily life. A 6th grade student from Prechistynskaya Middle School once wrote about his winter vacation. "I had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go for bread. The 20th or 30th person in line even though the bread was not delivered until 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I had to freeze on the street for 5 or 6 hours. They didn't deliver enough bread. You stand freezing and you have to go home without anything because you weren't able to get even a kilogram of bread." People came to Moscow from all over the country to buy things and slept in train stations. Women would even pass nursing babies from hand to hand because whoever had the baby could move to the front of the line. Once people finally bought something, they would immediately damage it. If they bought bread, they cut it open on the spot. If they bought flour or grain, they mixed it together. Because once the goods were damaged, the police could not easily return them to the store. The Soviet Union under Stalin is hard to sum up in one word. It had champagne and caviar. It also had black bread, red lines, and freezing wind. So here's the question. If you had to choose one food to represent the Soviet Union under Stalin, what would it be? Write your choice in the comments. This is Reddish History. See you next time.